Two strangers meet at a war-torn border. She's a foreign doctor. He's a local translator. The connection is immediate, undeniable, and impossible. In a place where every choice is watched, every word carries weight, they risk everything for something as fragile as hope. But some forces can't be outrun. And some stories don't end the way we want them to. How far can love stretch before the world breaks it? Hello family, welcome to Storytime with Imzi. Please subscribe and like, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The checkpoint buzzed with tension. Heat shimmered off rusted fencing, and the sharp tang of diesel clung to the air. Somewhere beyond the border wall, muffled shouting echoed through static-filled radios. Soldiers stood rigid in their uniforms, eyes darting between papers and faces, fingers twitching on triggers. Hazel stepped down from the truck, boots crunching on dry gravel. Dust swirled around her as she adjusted her canvas satchel and tugged her sleeves down over her wrists, instinctively trying to cover the bright red patch on her shoulder. International Medical Unit. A target as much as a shield in this fractured land. She was bone-tired after 20 hours of travel through half-paved roads and military inspections, but her spine stayed straight. This wasn't her first war zone, but something about this place, the tension in the air, the quiet eyes watching from windows, felt different. And then she saw him. He stood beside the patrol hut, just outside the line of shouting officers and scanning drones. Naveen. Lean frame, sunburned skin, a scarf loosely knotted around his neck. He wasn't dressed like a soldier, and he didn't move like one either. He leaned casually on the side of the building, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold with a stillness that didn't belong here. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Hazel's breath caught, not from recognition but something stranger. Like déjà vu. As if she had known his face before this moment, as if his gaze had been waiting for hers to arrive. Naveen tilted his head slightly, almost amused. Then, without a word, he pushed off the wall and walked toward her. "You're with the medical convoy?" he asked in crisp English, lightly accented calm. She nodded. "Dr. Hazel Moran. From Geneva." "I figured. The coat gave you away." He gave a small smile, not quite reaching his eyes. "You're lucky you made it before curfew. Things tend to get unpredictable after sunset." Hazel glanced at the barricades, the soldiers, the tension that coiled like wire around every word spoken in this place. "I'm beginning to notice." "Come," he said, gesturing toward a tent just past the checkpoint. "I'll walk you through registration. The officials like it better when someone local handles the introductions." She hesitated just a second longer than she should have, watching the way he carried himself, careful, calculated, yet oddly open. He turned back, eyebrows raised slightly. "I don't bite," he said. "No," she replied, falling into step beside him. "But something tells me this place does." He laughed, low, rough-edged, and for a moment the heaviness lifted. They walked through the checkpoint, past watchful eyes and guns that never seemed to lower. Hazel could feel the heat of stares, but Naveen moved like a shield beside her, intercepting questions in a language she didn't yet know, speaking with enough authority to disarm suspicion. She didn't know his full name, or why he wasn't in uniform, or how someone could seem both at home and completely above it all. But she knew one thing, carved into her instincts like a flare of light. She would see him again. And that scared her more than the guns. The night convoy was behind schedule. The last of the supplies had been packed under low lantern light, crates marked with red crosses and taped in layers thick enough to withstand shrapnel. The moon hung low, fat and yellow, casting ghostly shadows over the narrow dirt road leading eastward into the hills. Hazel pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she climbed into the back of the transport truck. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that soaked into your chest and settled behind your ribs. She took a seat beside a crate of antibiotics, steadying herself as the engine rattled to life. Then Naveen climbed in, the truck shifting slightly under his weight. He gave her a brief glance and said nothing, just settled opposite her with a battered leather journal in his lap. His presence filled the space like a question left hanging. For miles, neither of them spoke. The truck jostled over potholes, the silence thickening between them like fog. Outside, Trees leaned in like eavesdroppers. Occasionally, gunfire cracked in the far distance, dry and sharp. No one flinched anymore. That was the scariest part. Finally, Naveen closed the journal. "You ever hear the term Ghost Road?" he asked, voice quiet. Hazel shook her head. "This path we're on," he said. "It used to be part of a village route. Before the war. Families would walk it every Sunday to a chapel at the top of the hill." He looked out into the darkness. "Now, only soldiers and supply trucks come through here. And only at night." Hazel followed his gaze into the void. "What happened to the village?" "Gone," he said simply. "Shelling 2 winters ago." A silence fell again, this time heavier. Hazel could feel the weight of things unsaid building behind his eyes. "Why do you still come back here?" she asked. He looked at her like she had asked a more complicated question than he was ready to answer. "Because someone has to," he said at last. "And because I still remember how it used to sound. The laughter. Bells." Hazel lowered her gaze. She wasn't here to ask questions like that. She was here to mend wounds, count 4 bags, stitch skin back together, and pretend it would all mean something in the end. A sudden jolt threw them forward, an explosion close. The truck skidded to a halt. The driver shouted in 2 languages. Gunfire erupted from a hillside. Panic cracked open inside her chest like ice underfoot. "Out!" someone yelled. Naveen grabbed her wrist before she could react and pulled her down from the truck. They sprinted through dry grass, ducking behind the remains of a collapsed stone structure. Adrenaline blurred the edges of her vision. Hazel's breath came in harsh gasps. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of gunfire, like popcorn snapping in the distance, and her pulse thudding in her ears. Then silence. They crouched together, pressed shoulder to shoulder beneath the jagged bones of the ruin. Naveen didn't speak. He just offered her his scarf when he saw her hands shaking. They stayed there like that for a long time, breathing the same dusty air, listening to the wind drag the smell of gunpowder through the broken windows. She looked at him. His face was calm again, even here. Especially here. "You always this calm under fire?" she whispered. He turned his head, met her eyes. "No," he said. "Only when someone else is more afraid than me." Hazel swallowed. The fear was still in her chest, coiled and restless, but so was something else. Something warm. She didn't know what it was. But when his hand brushed hers, barely, just a moment, it was enough to make the noise of the world fall away. The morning after the ambush, the convoy limped back into camp just after sunrise. The damage had been minimal, miraculously. A few grazes, 1 dislocated shoulder, and a shattered crate of surgical gauze. But the silence among the medics told a different story. Everyone had come back, but something had shifted. Hazel didn't see Naveen for 2 days. The official word was operational restructuring. The real word was surveillance. After the attack, higher command clamped down. Movement was restricted. Foreign aid workers were issued curfews and closely monitored. The easy flow between the international tents and local staff areas slowed to a trickle. Even the kitchen was segregated. It was subtle, no sirens, no orders, but unmistakable. Hazel spent her days stitching gunshot wounds and fitting prosthetics. At night, she sat in her cot with the pendant necklace, the one Naveen had quietly slipped into her hands as they returned from the convoy, warm against her palm. She didn't wear it. She didn't have to. She just held it, like proof that what had happened in the ruin wasn't something she imagined. And then she found the note. Folded into a loose corner of her supply bag was a small square of brown paper, barely larger than her palm. No name, no date. Just a line in neat handwriting. "There's a tree stump behind the second supply tent. If you want to talk." No signature. But she knew. That night, under the faint hum of generator lights, Hazel walked out after curfew, coat drawn tight, heart thudding like a drumbeat. The stump sat just where the note said, half sunk in the dust and barely noticeable. A crack ran down the middle, wide enough to slip something inside. There was nothing there. She returned to the tent with a strange ache in her chest. The next morning, another note appeared in her bag. "Be patient. The fence isn't the only thing between us." After that, it became a ritual. She would leave a message, sometimes just a sentence, sometimes pages, folded small and wrapped in plastic. She'd tuck it deep inside the stump and walk away, never looking back. And every few days, she would return to find one waiting. A sketch, a memory, a fragment of poetry in his voice. He never wrote his name. She never needed it. They never spoke of the rules they were breaking. Not the border laws. Not the invisible wall rising around them with each new soldier that arrived. But in those notes, in those handwritten worlds they built, they were free. Hazel wrote about her mother's garden in Vermont, the lilacs that bloomed late, and how the smell reminded her of forgiveness. Naveen replied with stories of mango trees that grew behind his grandfather's house and the sound of rain on a tin roof in August. He made the war feel far away. She made the fear feel smaller. But one day, the note she left didn't get a reply. And the day after that, the stump was gone. Not burned. Not crushed. Just gone, as if it had never been there. In its place was a fresh path of tire tracks in the dirt and 2 black boots, half buried beside it. Hazel stood there, fists clenched in her pockets. Dust blew into her eyes, but she didn't blink. She knew what this meant. And suddenly, the distance between them felt vast, too vast for paper and ink to cross. The chapel was barely standing. Its stone walls leaned like weary men, cracked and splintered by years of tremors and shellfire. Ivy clawed up the south-facing side, wrapping around fractured stained glass that no longer held color. Inside, dust floated in thick golden ribbons where the moonlight slipped through what remained of the roof. Hazel stood in the doorway, breath caught in her throat. He was already there, Naveen. Sitting in the pew closest to the altar, back to her, head tilted up toward the night sky peeking through the rafters. A small, tin lantern glowed at his side, casting long shadows across the stone floor. "You came," he said softly, without turning. Hazel stepped inside. "You didn't leave me much choice." He looked over his shoulder then, smiling just enough to cut through the tension in her chest. "They watch everything now," he said. "Even trees." She crossed the threshold and sat beside him, careful not to brush his arm. Their shoulders were close, too close, and yet not close enough. For a long moment, they just listened. To the wind hissing through the chapel's broken bones, to the far-off bark of dogs near the fence line, to the silence between them. Then Naveen reached into his coat and pulled out a small, polished piece of wood, no larger than a coin. He pressed it into her hand. It was a pendant, hand-carved, delicate, a tree whose branches spiraled out into stars. "I started it after that night behind the ruin," he said. "Didn't know what it was going to be. Just knew I had to keep my hands busy when I couldn't sleep." Hazel traced the lines with her fingers. "It's beautiful. It's not perfect," he said. "But it's real." She looked up at him then, really looked. His eyes were tired but steady. His jaw held tension like a habit he couldn't break. He had a small scar near his right temple she'd never noticed before. She wanted to touch it. Instead, she held the pendant against her chest. "Why here?" she asked. "My mother used to bring me here when I was a kid," he said. "Before the war. We'd light candles and pretend our prayers went straight through the ceiling to the stars." Hazel tilted her head toward the gaping hole above the altar. "I think your aim's improved." He laughed, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the world outside the chapel didn't exist. She reached into her coat and pulled out her radio, an old thing, held together with tape and hope. She turned the dial until static gave way to a melody, soft, foreign, a waltz maybe, or something slower. Music barely louder than breath. He stood and offered her a hand. "Dance with me?" Hazel stared at him. "Here," she asked, incredulous. "Now." He didn't answer, just waited, palm open, patient. She slipped her hand into his. They danced slowly between shattered pews and broken light. The dust shimmered around them like something holy. Their boots moved clumsily, but neither cared. Her head tilted to his chest, and for the first time since arriving, Hazel let herself close her eyes. Here, there were no fences, no curfews, no names spoken in hushed warnings. Just him, just her, just the music. They didn't kiss. They didn't have to. But when she lay beside him on the old stone floor that night, fully clothed, their hands linked between them, it was the most intimate moment of her life. She fell asleep to the rhythm of his breathing. And when she woke just before dawn, he was already up, watching the horizon shift from black to gray. No words, just a look. She stood, brushed dust from her sleeves, and walked with him out the chapel door. No goodbye. No promise. Only silence. And the sound of everything slipping just out of reach. The order came down at noon. Hazel had just finished suturing a boy's thigh. Shrapnel from a cooking fire turned mortar blast. When one of the UN escorts found her, crisp uniform stiff with urgency. Extraction in 48 hours. Be packed. Be ready. No explanation. No room to negotiate. She peeled off her gloves in stunned silence. Her hands, still smelling faintly of iodine and blood, curled into fists. She didn't ask why. She already knew. Things were deteriorating. The region was shifting from unstable to unsalvageable. The world had stopped sending help weeks ago. Only ghosts stayed behind now. And Naveen. She spent the next 12 hours trying to find him. The translator said he hadn't reported in for 2 days. The kitchen staff only shrugged. One guard muttered something about an arrest, border communication violation, but wouldn't say more. Hazel knew what that meant. Whispers caught on the wrong ears. A name mentioned one too many times in a report. A misplaced letter. She went to the chapel. Empty. She checked the tree stump, though it had long been leveled and cleared. Nothing. That night, sleep was impossible. Her duffel sat open on her cot, half filled with folded scrubs and a leather-bound notebook. The pendant lay on top like a question she didn't know how to answer. The camp stirred before sunrise. Evac teams moved like ghosts, silent and quick, loading crates, checking manifests, avoiding eye contact. Hazel kept scanning faces, hoping one might turn toward her with a wry smile and dark eyes that saw too much. But he never came. At the checkpoint, as the truck rumbled to life, she hesitated. The guard at the gate motioned impatiently. "Doctor," he barked, "we have to move now." She looked back. The wind kicked up dust behind her, blurring the rows of tents and tarps and dreams stitched together with twine. It was as if the entire camp had never existed. Like she might wake up and realize she'd only imagined the nights beneath broken ceilings, the touch of his hand in the dark, the letters left in a stump now gone. She climbed into the truck. As it pulled away, Hazel reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the pendant. It was warm from her palm. She closed her eyes and held it tightly against her chest. The road unspooled behind her, long and empty. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But a single line, one of Naveen's old notes, echoed in her memory like a heartbeat. If the sky never forgets our names, then maybe we never truly leave. Time did what time always does. It moved, indifferent, unbending. It did not pause for heartbreak or memory. Hazel returned home to a different kind of quiet. The city was intact, clean, sterile. Her flat overlooked a park where joggers passed beneath cherry trees and children rode scooters along paved paths. No one flinched at the sound of helicopters overhead. The air smelled of coffee and rain, not gunpowder and diesel. But something in her stayed behind, back on the red dirt road, under the chapel's broken roof, where her world had cracked open and never fully closed. She buried herself in work. Trauma rotations in 3 continents. A fellowship in reconstructive surgery. News articles called her brilliant, tireless, gifted beyond her years. She smiled for the cameras, shook the hands of ministers, accepted medals she never displayed. But late at night, when the noise faded, she'd sometimes pull out a thin wooden pendant from her nightstand drawer. She never wore it. She just needed to know it was still there. Naveen resurfaced like a rumor. Hazel had no contact with him. But every so often, an article would cross her desk. A blistering exposé under a pseudonym she recognized only by the rhythm of its voice. He wrote like he carved wood, delicately, precisely, without fear. He wrote about the forgotten, the silenced, the imprisoned. His words dug into power like fingers into wet soil. One piece in particular stopped her heart. "They burned the chapel last spring," he wrote. "Called it a hazard. It had stood for 90 years. They say memory is dangerous when left unchecked. But I remember every crack in that ceiling. Every note of a song that once played there, slow as breath, soft as goodbye. No name. No signature. Just a tree logo stamped in the corner of the page. Small, hand-drawn, unmistakable." Hazel sat alone in her office for a long time after reading it. Outside, rain slid down the windows in slow, deliberate lines. She watched it fall, fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. They were living parallel lives, both too brave to run, but too bound to leave the paths they'd chosen. She knew that if she reached out, she might compromise him. That in his country, her name still wasn't safe to say aloud. And he knew that dragging her back into his world might break her in ways no war ever had. So they didn't reach out. They just remembered. And in memory, they met often. In chapel ruins, in dance steps left unfinished, in words scribbled on scraps of paper now yellowed and folded like prayer. Hazel had everything she'd once dreamed of. But still, when she passed under low-hanging skies or caught a song with that same rhythm, she'd feel it again, that sharp, quiet ache. The kind that doesn't fade. The kind that waits. It arrived in a plain brown envelope, tucked between medical reports and hospital memos. So ordinary, she nearly threw it out. No return address. Just her name, handwritten in blue ink, the same way he used to write it, small, precise, quiet. Hazel didn't open it right away. She stared at it for a full hour, sitting in her office while monitors blinked around her and rain pattered softly on the window. She traced the edge of the flap with her thumb, already knowing what she'd find inside. Already afraid of it. Finally, she peeled it open. Inside was a book. Thin. Hand-stitched. The paper smelled of old wood and dust and ink. It had no title. But on the first page, in the center, written in the same familiar hand. You said lilacs smelled like forgiveness. I found a tree that bloomed in winter. I thought of you. Hazel's heart stilled. Her eyes skimmed the lines like a fevered dream. Poems, fragments of memory, stories carved in verse. And there, near the center of the book, was a poem she knew by heart. Because she had written it. One of the last letters she left in the stump. A letter she thought had been lost. The sky is heavy tonight like it knows our names. I don't want to leave, but I don't want to stay if you're not beside me. There's no right place, just a heartbeat I want to find again. At the very back of the book, just before the final page, was a single slip of paper, folded twice. It read, If you're reading this, I'll be at the poetry reading in Dubrovnik on the 18th. Near the harbor. Midnight. Maybe the sky will be kind. No name. No plea. Just a door left open. Hazel booked the flight that same night. No hesitation. No logic. Just something old and vital surging through her like wildfire. She packed light. One bag, her notebook, the pendant, and a coat that still smelled faintly of eucalyptus oil. The reading took place in a small, crumbling stone amphitheater tucked behind an old harbor wall. Candles flickered in mason jars on the steps. Locals gathered with worn books and scarves pulled close, murmuring beneath breathy verses and waves slapping quietly against the dock. Hazel stood at the back, heart pounding with every breath. Poets came and went. The crowd shifted, laughed, clapped softly. A breeze tugged at her scarf. And then him. He stepped onto the low platform, no fanfare. Just a worn sweater, tired eyes, and a piece of paper held carefully between his fingers. He looked older. There was a scar along his jaw she didn't remember. But it was him. Her knees nearly buckled. Naveen looked up and saw her. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, but he said nothing. He didn't smile. He just stared like she was a dream walking straight out of memory. Then, without a word, he read, We are not lost. We are waiting. We are stitched into silence. Beneath a sky that remembers. Even when we try to forget. Hazel didn't cry. She didn't move. But the world tilted slightly, just enough to let the impossible happen. When the reading ended, he stepped down slowly, walking past the flickering lights, past the lingering stairs, straight to where she stood beneath the archway. Neither of them spoke. He stopped in front of her, inches away, and then he reached out and touched her face, fingers light as dusk, as if afraid she'd vanish if he touched too hard. You're real, he whispered. Hazel nodded, her voice barely a breath. So are you. They didn't speak much that night. Words felt too small, too fragile. So they walked instead, through the sleeping streets of Dubrovnik, past shuttered cafes and salt-washed stone, down to the sea where the old fortress walls touched the edge of the dark water. Hazel took off her shoes. Naveen rolled up his sleeves. They sat side by side on the cold stone steps, ankles dangling above the tide. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It pulsed with everything they didn't need to say. They had been separated by war, borders, time, and silence. But in this sliver of borrowed peace, they were just two people beneath the same stars. Why now? She finally asked. Naveen leaned back on his hands, watching the moonlight ripple over the sea. Because I couldn't forget, he said. And because I needed to know that you didn't forget either. Hazel turned to him, eyes soft. I tried to. So did I. She reached into her coat pocket and held out the pendant, the one he'd carved, edges now worn smooth by years of being touched but never worn. His breath caught. You kept it. Hazel nodded. I wanted to wear it. I didn't. I was afraid if I did, I'd never take it off. A quiet smile tugged at his lips. That night, they checked into a small inn tucked behind a market square, its windows shuttered and warm with candlelight. They spent 1 week together. 7 nights. 7 sunrises. A lifetime in miniature. They made breakfast in a borrowed kitchen, burned toast, danced barefoot in a room too small for two. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't talk about what came next. Because they already knew. On the 7th day, as the train doors slid open with a low hiss, Naveen pulled her into one last embrace. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, solid, like roots sinking deep. Hazel buried her face in his neck and inhaled everything she could, salt, skin, the faint trace of ink and spice and memory. I could stay, she whispered. Not quite a question. Not quite a truth. You could, he murmured, his voice breaking. But you won't. She nodded, eyes stinging. You'll write again, she said. Even if I can't answer. And you'll heal people I'll never meet, he replied. But I'll know. They pulled apart slowly, as if cutting invisible threads. And just before she stepped onto the train, he reached out and tucked the pendant into her palm. This time, she didn't hide it. She slipped it over her head. Their eyes met through the closing doors. No waves. No last words. Only that same tether. Strong. Silent. Unbreakable. As the train pulled away, Hazel leaned against the window and looked up at the sky. It was overcast, thick with dusk, but she imagined stars burning behind it, steady and faithful like memory. And somewhere, on another piece of land carved by war and love and longing, she knew Naveen was doing the same. They were still under the same sky. And for now, that was enough.